The photograph they entered into evidence showed an empty crib, a half-packed suitcase, and a front door left standing open to the November dark. Under it, in a clean serif font meant to look like fact, ran a single line, *the mother left. She always leaves. *. I sat in the third row of courtroom 4B and watched my ex-husband's lawyer walk that photo to the bench like it was a smoking gun. I did not move. My hands stayed folded in my lap. My face stayed as still as I could make it, which after 11 months of practice was very still indeed. Because I knew something Marcus Vane did not know I knew, and I had known it since the night the picture was taken. That open door was mine. I took that photograph. My finger pressed the button, my phone recorded the moment, and the timestamp buried in the file he just handed the judge. The timestamp he thought he'd scrubbed away was going to end his career and everything he'd built the lie to do. Let me tell you how a woman who never once raised her voice took an entire manufactured case apart at the seams, and how the men who built it handed me every tool I needed to do it. There's a lawyer with a scar of her own she never showed a client, a man named Julian who lost this same fight 6 years before I did, and a night 3 weeks before the hearing when the whole plan nearly came apart in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. I'll tell you all of it, in order because the order is the point. But first you need to know what he was trying to take and how it started. Before I go on, how has your day been so far? I truly hope it's been a kind one to you, and whatever you're carrying today, I wish you the very best of life. May it be gentle with you, and may the truth always fall your way. If stories like this one, where patient people let the truth win quietly, are the kind you want more of, take a moment and subscribe to Revenge Lab. It's a small thing, and it means everything to a channel like this. Now, let me start at the beginning. My name is Elena Reyes, and until the winter of 2024, I believed the worst thing my marriage could cost me was money. I was wrong. Money is replaceable. What it cost me was the right to be believed, and there is no account you can draw that back out of. Daniel and I split in the spring, and it was not dramatic, which is maybe why it hurt in a way the dramatic ones don't. There was no other woman, no throne plate, no scene on the lawn for the neighbors. There was only the slow, quiet discovery that the man I had married treated our life the way an accountant treats a spreadsheet, and that he had, sometime when I wasn't looking, moved me from the asset column to the liability column and closed the tab. We had a daughter. Nadia was 6 that year, gap-toothed, obsessed with herons, and she slept every night with a gray stuffed bird named Mr. Feathers, whose left wing had been loved down to the batting. We had a small house in the grove with a lemon tree by the back fence that had never once fruited in 4 years, a running joke between us before things went cold. And we had, I truly believed, an agreement, shared custody, and even split of what we'd built, no war. Daniel had said the words to my face in our kitchen. *No war, Elena, we're better than that. I believed him because I wanted to, which is how most people get hurt. My father, a court reporter of 31 years, had a saying, Elena, the truth is boring and it is patient. Liars are the ones in a hurry. I rolled my eyes at it as a teenager. I'd need it soon enough. I did not understand in the beginning why Daniel could not simply let it be even. We had enough. Nadia was happy. But I have come to think that some people cannot tolerate a fair ending, that fairness feels, to them, like losing, because they have measured their whole lives by whether they came out ahead of the person across the table. Daniel had spent our marriage keeping a private scoreboard I never knew existed, and the divorce was simply the day he finally showed me the numbers. He was not angry, that was the frightening part. He was strategic, and he had been strategic, I would later realize, for a long time before I signed anything. Daniel was in a hurry. 3 weeks after the papers were filed, he hired Marcus Vane, and the war he'd promised we were better than began, from his side only, because I did not yet know we were fighting. I want to go back further because you should know what I lost, not just what was taken from me. If I only tell you the fight, you'll only ever see Daniel as the villain of a courtroom drama. He was that. But he was also, for 6 years, the man who learned to make my coffee exactly the way I liked it without ever being told twice, and the man who cried, actually cried, in the hospital hallway the day Nadia was born, and I owe you the truth of that too, because the truth is the whole point of this story. The scorekeeping, I understand now, started small and I mistook it for something else. 2 years before the split, on my birthday, Daniel gave me nothing, no card, no dinner, nothing, and when I finally asked, hurt, whether he'd forgotten, he said, very evenly, "You forgot my work dinner in March." I didn't make a thing of it. I had not known until that sentence that March had been logged somewhere, dated, filed, waiting to be produced as evidence in an argument I didn't know we were having. I laughed it off at the time. I told myself every marriage has a ledger like that, small and harmless, the kind you keep without meaning to. I did not understand that Daniel's ledger was not harmless. It was a draft of the one Marcus Vane would later write in a much more expensive font. There was a night, maybe 8 months before he moved out, when Nadia had a fever of 103 and I was up with her until 4 in the morning, cooling her wrists with a washcloth while Daniel slept through it because he said the next morning, an early meeting. I did not resent it then. I resent it a little now, not for the sleep, but for what I learned afterward, that he remembered that night too, filed it under a heading I never saw. Something like Elena handles it, Elena always handles it, therefore Elena does not need me. He did not experience that night as my exhaustion. He experienced it as evidence that I was self-sufficient enough to be replaced. The last good conversation we had before the letters started was in that same kitchen, 3 weeks before he moved out, both of us sitting at the table long after Nadia was asleep, and Daniel said, quietly, almost like he meant it, that he didn't want either of us to become someone Nadia would have to explain to a therapist in 20 years. I told him I didn't either. We shook on it, actually shook on it, like two people closing a deal instead of ending a marriage. And I remember feeling, walking him to the door that night, something almost like relief, that if the marriage had to end, at least it would end the way he'd promised, evenly, without war. I did not know, shaking his hand, that I was shaking hands with a man who had already, weeks earlier, quietly moved $61,000 into his mother's name. I tell you this not to excuse what came later. Nothing excuses what came later. But because the 11 months in that courtroom only make sense if you understand that Daniel did not become a stranger overnight. He had been assembling the tools for a long time, quietly, the way you'd assemble a case, and I had been living inside a marriage without knowing it had already become one man's exhibit file. You have met a Marcus Vane, even if you have never set foot in a courthouse. He was the kind of man who shakes your hand while looking at your watch. He wore a haircut styled to look far more expensive than it was, drove a leased car one class above his means, and practiced what his website called aggressive family advocacy, which is a billing euphemism for organized cruelty. His firm's tagline, printed on the letterhead I would come to know intimately, was "We fight for you." What they meant was, we fight, and you pay by the hour for the swinging. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. I remember because Nadia had lost a tooth that morning, and I was still riding the small joy of it when I opened the envelope at my kitchen counter. The letter accused me of chronic instability, of unexplained and repeated absences from the marital home, of being a mother whose commitment to the minor child is, at best, situational and conditional. I read it twice. The floor seemed to tilt under my socks. Not one sentence of it was true, and I remember thinking, with a naivete that embarrasses me now, there's been some mistake, I'll just call and explain. There had been no mistake. That was the entire point. Truth was not the product Marcus Vane was selling. Doubt was, you do not have to prove a mother unfit, you only have to raise enough smoke that a busy judge, protecting a child, decides to play it safe. Vane sold smoke by the ream. The second letter came 10 days later, and it went for the money. It claimed I had dissipated marital assets, that I had drained accounts, concealed funds, and spent recklessly in anticipation of divorce. It asked the court to freeze the joint assets that were half mine and to grant Daniel temporary primary custody of Nadia, in the interest of the minor child's stability and continuity of care. Stability. He used my own daughter's need for stability as the crowbar to take her from me. I called my father that night. I was standing in my apartment kitchen with the letter shaking in my hand, and I could barely get the words out. He was quiet a long time on the other end. My father's silences always meant he was thinking, not that he was gone. Then he said the thing I would carry through everything that came after. Don't answer the noise, Mija. Answer the record. Write down every single thing that happens. Date it. Save it. Keep copies of the copies. And whatever else you do, do not chase them. When a man is running toward a cliff, you do not run after him. You let him run. So I started a ledger. Not the kind Daniel kept, the kind that hides money. Mine was built out of proof, and I built it the way my father cleaned his machine, slowly on Sundays, with a kind of patience that felt, in those early weeks, almost like defeat. I bought a cheap brown accordion file from the drugstore and labeled the tabs in pencil so I could erase and resort. Custody, finances, communications, timeline, medical, school. Every accusation Vane fired, I answered into a folder instead of into a phone call. This is the discipline that saved me, and I want to be precise about it because it's the whole secret. When you are being lied about, every cell in your body wants to pick up the phone and shout asterisk that isn't true. Asterisk shouting goes nowhere. It leaves no record. It just teaches the liar where your nerves are. When Vane claimed I had unexplained absences, I already had them explained, and better than explained, documented by a party with no stake in my divorce. I was a hospice nurse. I worked nights at St. Columba's, and my shifts were logged to the minute by an electronic badge system my employer was legally required to preserve for years. 11-hour nights, badge swipes stamped 6:58 p.m., going in, and 6:04 a.m., coming out. Each shift signed off by a charge nurse named Priya Anand, who had worked beside me for 4 years and thought the world of me. My absences from the marital home were me sitting in the dark, holding the hands of strangers while they died, so they would not have to do it alone. I printed 14 months of those logs and slid them behind the timeline tab, and I said nothing. When he claimed I had dissipated assets, I pulled every bank and card statement going back 3 years and laid them out on my living room floor like a game of solitaire that took a full weekend to deal. I had not moved a single dollar. Every account balanced. But somewhere in that solitaire I found something else, a transfer, in February, of $61,000 out of our joint savings and into an account held under the name of Daniel's mother, Coralie. I sat on the floor and looked at it for a long time. I did not point at it. I did not tell Ruth yet. I did not so much as breathe on it. My father's voice was right there in the room with me. Asterisk, let them run. Asterisk, you do not warn a man walking toward a cliff. You simply make certain that when he arrives, the survey markers are exact and the fall is real. I photographed that statement twice, backed it up to a drive I kept in an old coffee tin in the back of a cabinet, and slid the paper behind the finances tab where it waited, quiet as a held breath, for 8 months. There were nights the discipline nearly broke me. I sat on my apartment floor with the accordion file open and a glass of wine I didn't finish, reading Vane's latest letter, and felt the injustice of it rise in my throat like something physical. He was being paid to say I did not love my own child, the child whose fevers I had cooled at 3 a.m, whose first word was heron. Some nights I wrote the furious reply, every word I wanted to scream, then deleted it letter by letter and dated another page instead. The rage did not go away. I just gave it a job. By June I had 400 pages. By September I had 1,100. And Marcus Vane, receiving nothing back from me but calm, on time, minimal responses through my lawyer, came to believe he was fighting a woman who wasn't fighting at all. He was fighting a woman who was building a case so complete that when the day came, it would not need her to fight. It would simply need to be opened. I should tell you about Ruth Acaffer, because I could not have done any of this alone, and because she understood me faster than anyone ever has. I found her the way you find the good ones, by asking a nurse. Priya's cousin had gone through an ugly custody fight and come out with her kids and her dignity, and she gave me one name. Ruth had practiced family law for 22 years out of a modest office above a dry cleaner, and she was known, by the people who knew, for 2 qualities. She never lied, and she went very, very quiet right before she won. Our first meeting, I brought the accordion file, already fat, and set it on her desk. She did not open it right away. She looked at it, then at me, over a pair of reading glasses she wore low on her nose. Most people, she said, come in here with a story and no paper. You've come in with paper and no story. Tell me the story. So I did, and when I got to the part about my father, asterisk, don't chase them, let them run, asterisk, she took off the glasses and folded them and said, your father was a court reporter. I asked how she knew. Because only someone who's watched 1,000 trials from the cheap seats understands that the record wins and the tantrum loses. Most lawyers don't understand it. You do. That was the day I knew I was going to be all right, even though I was months from the worst of it. Ruth's instinct early was to swing. She wanted to move to dismiss Vane's absurd instability claims the moment we had the badge logs. I asked her to wait. She raised an eyebrow. If we swing now, I said, we knock down one lie and Vane learns caution. If we wait, he keeps building. I don't want him lower on the ladder. I want him at the very top. Ruth looked at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled, the first time I saw the quiet, dangerous smile that meant she'd found a person who thought the way she did. You want him all the way up, she said, before you take the ladder away. I said yes. That is patient and it is a little bit cruel, she said, and I have never in 22 years had a client with the nerve to actually do it. All right, we wait. I found out why Ruth trusted a stranger's instinct for patience so completely on a night in October, dropping off another stack for the communications tab. She poured 2 glasses of the bad wine she kept in a filing cabinet and told me about a client named Denise, 19 years earlier, Ruth's second year of practice, a custody fight against a husband who was cruel in small, deniable ways. When his lawyer filed a motion Ruth knew was dishonest, she swung immediately, hard, publicly, before she had the paperwork to prove it. She was right about the lie. She was wrong about the timing. The judge saw an aggressive young lawyer making unproven claims against a calm opposing counsel, and Denise lost primary custody. Ruth had been right, and it hadn't mattered. I did the tantrum, Ruth said, turning the glass in her hand. I've spent 22 years since then teaching myself to wait, and I still hate every second of it. You're the first client who's ever made it easy. She didn't say Denise's name again, but I understood after that exactly what it was costing her every week we sat on the $61,000 instead of using it, and exactly how much was riding on us being right about the timing this time, because she'd already watched what happens to a mother when the wait fails. In November, they escalated, and this is the night the photograph was born, so I need to slow down and tell it exactly as it happened. It was Daniel's custodial week. On the Thursday at 9:40 p.m., he called me. I was between shifts, home, half asleep on the couch. His voice was tight, hurried. He said Nadia was asking for me and wouldn't settle, was crying, could I please come by just for a few minutes to calm her down. He'd never asked before. Something in it felt off, but she was my daughter and she was crying. And there is no mother alive who weighs the vibe of a phone call against a crying child. I put on my coat and drove across town in the cold. When I got to the house, every light was on but the place was silent. And the front door, I will never forget this, was standing wide open to the street, to the November dark, cold air pouring into the hall. Nadia was alone in the living room. Alone. 6 years old, awake past 10, still in her little coat, sitting on the floor by the couch with Mr. Feathers pressed to her face, crying the quiet, worn-out cry of a child who has been crying a while. Daniel was not there. His car was gone. I did what any mother does without thinking. I got down on the floor and held her. I got her warm. I checked every room to be sure no one else was there, locked the door, and started calling Daniel. I called him 4 times. I texted him twice. He didn't answer. So I took my daughter home to my apartment, made her toast and warm milk, tucked her into my bed with the heron, and sat beside her until her breathing evened out. And before I'd left that cold, empty house, I had done one more thing, the thing 11 months of my father's training had made pure reflex. I took out my phone and I photographed the scene. The empty living room, the little half-packed weekend bag by the couch, the open front door with the dark behind it. I did not know, standing there in my coat, why I would ever need those pictures. I only knew what my father had drilled into me since I was a girl. Asterisk, you always take the picture. Be the witness. Asterisk. Daniel finally answered near midnight, breezy, unbothered. He said he'd just stepped out for a bit. He said it like a man ordering coffee. I logged the call. I saved the texts. I put the photos in the coffee tin drive that night, behind the custody tab in spirit if not in paper, and I did not know, could not have known, that 5 months later Marcus Vane would stand up in courtroom 4B, hold that very photograph over his head, and tell a judge it proved that I had abandoned my child. Here is the thing about a lie that no one tells you. A lie is not a static object. A lie wants to grow. A careful liar tells one and stops and gets away with it, but Marcus Vane was not a careful liar. He was a builder, an architect of invention, and once I understood that about him, I made a decision that Ruth called the boldest she'd ever seen a client make. I decided to hand him lumber. Through December and January, every time Vane's letters grew a little more confident, a little more baroque in their invention, I made certain, through Ruth, that our responses stayed thin, procedural, almost meek. Not weak enough to concede anything real. Just weak enough that a man who measured people by whether they fought back would conclude I had nothing to fight with. I answered discovery requests with exactly what the rules required and not one document more. I let my own deposition testimony come out halting and nervous, because a nervous woman does not look like a woman sitting on 1,100 pages of proof. Ruth called it privately, feeding the confidence. Every month Vane didn't get pushed back, his letters grew a rung taller. By February, the instability claim had grown a second head. Now it wasn't only unexplained absences, it was a full narrative, dates invented, incidents implied that had simply never happened. He was no longer reacting to evidence. He was inventing it, because for 10 months, inventing things had cost him nothing. It was Daniel, not Vane, who made it real. On a Sunday handoff in late January, in the driveway in front of Nadia buckling herself into her booster seat, he told me casually, like he was mentioning the weather, that he'd asked the court to cut my time to alternating weekends only, until things got sorted out. He did not say it to hurt me in front of her. I don't think he thought about her hearing it at all, which was somehow worse. Nadia looked up from her seatbelt and asked, in the flat, direct way 6-year-olds ask the questions adults spend years learning to dodge, "Am I not staying at mommy's as much?" Daniel told her not to worry about grown-up things. I told her, steady as I could make my voice, that nothing was changing that week, which was true, and got in my car, and did not cry until I was 3 blocks away. That was the moment the case stopped being paper to me. It had a booster seat in it now, and a 6-year-old's question, and I understood that every page I filed after that wasn't for a judge. It was for her. 3 separate threads were forming that winter, though I did not yet see them as one cord. The badge log sat behind timeline, complete and untouchable. The $61,000 sat behind finances, waiting. And somewhere, though I didn't know it yet, a private investigator Ruth had quietly retained named Frank Delgado was starting to pull the 3rd thread, the thread that would end up mattering more than either of the other 2. My own deposition happened that January, in a glass conference room on the 11th floor of a building I'd never had reason to enter before, and it is worth telling you what it cost me to sit through it, because the calm you'll see in the courtroom later did not come free. Vane deposed me for 6 hours. He asked the same 3 accusations in a dozen different disguises, hoping I'd trip over my own answers the way a nervous woman might. Did I recall the evening of October the 14th? Had I ever, at any time, left my daughter unsupervised? Could I explain, for the record, my pattern of absence from the marital home? I answered each one plainly, briefly, and without embellishment, the way Ruth had coached me, *, never fill a silence, Elena, silence is not yours to manage, it's his *. And every time I didn't take the bait, I watched something in Vane's face tighten. Some small recalibration of a man discovering his opponent wasn't going to perform panic for him. At one point, near hour 5, he leaned back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won and said, almost kindly, "Ms. Reyes, I want you to understand this doesn't have to be adversarial. If you're willing to be reasonable about custody, my client is prepared to be generous about the house." It was, I understood later, an offer to trade my daughter for a roof, dressed up as generosity, and I remember the specific physical effort it took not to answer the offer itself, only the question actually on the record. I'd ask my attorney to address any settlement discussion outside of this deposition. I said, and watched him write something down, satisfied, mistaking my discipline for weakness. Ruth told me afterward that his associate had smirked twice during my testimony, once when I paused before answering a question about my work schedule, and once when my voice caught, just slightly, describing the night of the empty crib. They read every quiet moment as evidence I was cracking. They never once considered that a woman can be shaking on the inside and still tell the truth in a level voice, and that the 2 things are not the same as losing. Frank Delgado had done investigative work for family lawyers for 11 years, and Ruth brought him in that January not to dig up dirt on Daniel, but to ask a much stranger, much colder question. Had Marcus Vane ever done this before? It took him 6 weeks. Vane had practiced for 14 years and had on paper an unremarkable record, dozens of ordinary custody cases, nothing that jumped out. But Frank had a habit other investigators didn't. He read the *settled* cases as carefully as the ones that went to trial, because settlements are where the ugly ones hide. Buried in a county docket from 6 years earlier, he found a case that had ended not in a ruling, but in a quiet, sealed settlement, a father named Julian Ibarra who had lost primary custody of his 2 children after his ex-wife's attorney entered, among other things. A photograph and a series of text messages that Julian's own lawyer, at the time, had lacked the resources to properly challenge. Julian Ibarra's attorney had not been Marcus Vane, but the wife's expert witness on the digital evidence, the man who had certified the photograph's authenticity in that case, was a name Frank recognized instantly, because it was the same forensic expert whose signature was already sitting on the file Vane had submitted against me. A man named Perry Koss, who ran a 2-person shop out of a strip mall and who had, it turned out, certified digital evidence in 4 other contested custody cases over the past 9 years, 3 of which the parent challenging the evidence had lost. Frank found Julian Ibarra living 2 counties over, remarried, seeing his children on alternating weekends under a custody order he had never stopped believing was built on a lie he could never prove. When Frank called him and asked, gently, whether he'd ever wondered if the photograph in his case had been altered, Julian was quiet on the line for so long Frank thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I have wondered that every single day for 6 years, and no one has ever asked me the question out loud before." I met Julian in March in Ruth's office at a table that suddenly felt too small for what was happening around it. He was a broad, quiet man with a laugh you could tell he used to have more of. He told me his story, and it was my story with different names stitched over it, the same shape, the same weapon, a photograph presented as proof of abandonment, a forensic expert who never once had his methods actually tested in court because Julian's lawyer hadn't known to ask. "I lost my kids' bedtimes for 6 years over a picture that might not even be real," he said, "and I never got to find out because nobody ever made anybody prove it." When I asked whether he would be willing to testify to what he now suspected, he didn't pause the way you'd expect a cautious man to pause. He said, "I have been waiting 6 years for someone to ask me that question." Yes. Before he left the office that day, he told me something that changed how I understood the whole case. His custody loss hadn't only cost him weekends, the legal fees fighting the original claim had cost him his business, a small landscaping company he'd spent a decade building, because he'd spent everything he had trying to prove a negative nobody would let him prove. "The number on paper is never the real cost," he told me. "The real cost is everything underneath the number that never makes it into any court record." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. Julian's case gave us something we hadn't had before, not just a fabricated exhibit, but a pattern. Perry Koss was not a man who had made one mistake. He was a tool Marcus Vane and lawyers like him used again and again, because until that winter, no one had ever compared his work across cases. Ruth added a new tab to my accordion file that week, though by then it lived mostly in a locked cabinet rather than a folder. She labeled it, simply, *pattern. I have told this story, up to now, as though the plan never wavered. It nearly did, and I want to tell you about the night it almost broke, because the story isn't honest without it. It was 3 weeks before the hearing, the last week of March, and Ruth called me at 11 at night, which she had never once done. Her voice, always so level, had an edge in it I hadn't heard before. Vane's office had filed an emergency motion demanding immediate, expanded discovery of all electronic devices and cloud accounts belonging to me, framed as necessary to investigate my digital communications regarding the minor child. On its face, it looked routine. Ruth did not think it was routine. She thought someone, possibly Perry Koss himself, possibly someone smarter sitting behind him, had gotten nervous, was fishing to see whether I was sitting on something, and was trying to force an early look into the coffee tin drive before we were ready to use it. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the accordion file open in front of me and did the math over and over. If the motion was granted broadly, our forensic evidence on the photograph's metadata might be exposed to the other side before the hearing, before Vane had fully committed to the fabricated exhibit in front of a judge. If that happened, Vane wouldn't fall. He would simply, quietly withdraw the photograph, blame a clerical error, and Daniel would settle on softer terms, and Marcus Vane would walk out of that courthouse having learned nothing and lost nothing. And somewhere down the line, another mother or father would be sitting where I was sitting, with no one there to catch it, because we would have spent our best evidence defending a motion instead of ending a career. Ruth fought the scope of the motion the way I had learned by then, that she fought everything not loudly, but with precision. She argued successfully that the request was overbroad and not narrowly tailored to any specific factual dispute properly before the court, and Judge Cole, in a preliminary ruling, cut it down to almost nothing, ordering only what was already scheduled to be produced at the regular evidentiary hearing. We had come, by Ruth's later estimate, within one unlucky judge of losing the whole architecture of the plan 3 weeks before it was due to spring. I hung up the phone that night at nearly 1 a.m. and sat very still at my kitchen table, and for the first time in 11 months, I let myself cry not from grief, but from the sheer exhaustion of having almost lost a war I didn't start by being one ruling away from careful. I did not sleep. I made coffee at 4, opened the file, and kept working, because the only thing worse than a near miss is letting a near miss talk you into stopping. Daniel called me himself the next evening, which he almost never did anymore. No lawyer on the line, no letterhead. He sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard since before the split. "This doesn't have to go to a hearing, Elena," he said. "We could just talk, figure something out, just us." For one long second, I almost believed there was a version of him underneath all of it that wanted out as badly as I did. Then he added, quieter, "Marcus says the hearing's going to get ugly. For both of us." And there it was, not an olive branch, a warning, sent the day after his own lawyer had tried and failed to see what I was holding. I told him I'd have Ruth call his attorney, and I hung up, and I understood that even now, 3 weeks from the end, he still thought the ugliness belonged to me. There is a version of this story where I tell you only about ledgers and lawyers and metadata, and it would be a lie of omission, because for 11 months I was not only building a case. I was raising a 6-year-old who had no idea her whole world was balanced on a courtroom date, and protecting that ignorance took a discipline every bit as hard as anything I did with the accordion file. Nadia knew her parents lived in different houses now. She did not know why. I made a rule for myself in the first week of the letters, and I never once broke it. Nothing about the case would ever touch her, not a raised voice on the phone within her hearing, not a stray comment about her father, not so much as a sigh she might misread. Some evenings, I would hang up from Ruth with my hands actually trembling, and Nadia would walk into the kitchen asking what was for dinner, and I would put the phone face down on the counter and become, within 3 seconds, a person entirely made of grilled cheese and homework and did you brush your teeth. I got good at that transformation. I am not entirely proud of how good, because it meant I was living 2 full lives inside one exhausted body, and only one of those lives ever got to rest. I took her to see a child therapist that winter, not because anything was visibly wrong, but to check the foundation before a crack could show. Her name was Dr. Osai, and after the 3rd session she told me Nadia had mentioned the night of the open door, not with fear, but with one small detail. She told me the door was cold, not that she was scared, that the door was cold. Ruth asked once, gently, whether Dr. Osai's notes might help corroborate the timeline. I said no. Nadia's therapy was not going to become an exhibit. Some rooms don't belong to the record, even when the record would like to have them. The hardest night of the whole 11 months had nothing to do with Vane at all. It was a Tuesday in February, ordinary on its surface, when Nadia asked me at the dinner table, out of nowhere, in the flat, unguarded way children ask the questions that levels an adult, "Is Daddy trying to take me away from you?" I do not know what she had overheard or pieced together from the strange new silences in both houses, but I remember setting down my fork very carefully so my hand wouldn't shake, and I remember thinking of my father's voice, answer the record, not the noise, and understanding, for the first time, that the lesson applied here too, to a 6-year-old across a kitchen table, not only to a judge. I told her the truth, sized to fit her. That grown-ups sometimes disagree about grown-up things, that it had nothing to do with anything she'd done, that she was not going anywhere she didn't belong, and that I would always tell her the truth even when it was hard, which was the only promise I intended to keep no matter what happened in that courtroom. She nodded, satisfied the way only a child can be by an honest answer, and asked if we could have ice cream. I said yes. I cried in the shower after she was asleep, where she couldn't hear it. The evidentiary hearing was set for a Wednesday in April, before Judge Harriet Cole, who had sat on the family bench for 19 years and was known around the courthouse for exactly 2 things: extraordinary patience with frightened litigants and a famously short fuse for lawyers who lied to her face. Vane came in swaggering. He wore his best suit and he had, I still can hardly believe it, a slide deck. An actual projected slide deck in a custody hearing with my 6-year-old daughter's name printed across the title bar in white letters. He opened not with the photograph, but with a long, confident recitation of patterns of instability, dates and incidents that existed nowhere but in his filings, delivered with the easy fluency of a man who has never once had to defend a claim in real time. Slide after slide clicked past, a timeline he had built from nothing, red arrows connecting invented incidents to a conclusion he decided on months before any of them supposedly occurred. He used the phrase erratic caregiving pattern 4 times. He used a photograph of my apartment building, taken from the street, captioned only * the mother's residence, * as though the building itself were an accusation. I sat through 18 minutes of a man building a case entirely out of air, delivered with the total, unhesitating confidence of someone who has never once been asked to show his work, and I understood, watching him, exactly what Ruth had meant that first afternoon about wanting him at the very top of the ladder. He was enjoying himself. He believed, completely, that this was the easiest file of his career. He introduced Perry Koss as an expert witness and had him testify, briefly and smoothly, that the photograph he was about to present had been forensically verified as unaltered, using the confident, faintly bored cadence of a man who had given this exact testimony in front of other judges many times before and never once been challenged on it. Koss did not know, sitting in that chair, that Julian Ibarra's name was already written on a witness list Ruth had not yet had to use. Then Vane led with the empty crib photograph, walked it up to the bench with the theatrical gravity of a man delivering a verdict rather than an exhibit, and read his line aloud. * the mother left. She always leaves. * then he put up the fabricated text message and read it in a wounded, trembling voice, pausing after * she's your problem now *, as though the cruelty of it had personally injured him. Daniel sat behind his lawyer the whole time, and he never once looked at me. I watched the back of his neck go slowly red. And I did nothing. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face still. Every instinct I had was screaming to stand up, to shout that the photo was mine, that the text was invented, that I had been on the floor of that house with our crying child while he read a poem about my abandonment. I let all of it go past me. I let Marcus Vane climb every last rung to the very top of the ladder. And when he finished, flushed and satisfied, and said the petitioner rests on this point, Your Honor, Ruth Ackheffer stood up. She did not raise her voice. She never does. Your Honor, she said, opposing counsel has entered 2 documents and offered an expert opinion regarding both that I'd like the court to examine closely. I'll begin with the photograph. May I approach with the carrier records and the device forensics? What happened over the next 40 minutes did not feel like a fight. It felt like watching a tall building come down, not in a bang, but in a long, slow exhale of dust, floor settling onto floor, until there is only quiet and a cloud where the thing used to stand. Ruth put the 2 photographs on the screen side by side. On the left, Vane's cropped exhibit. On the right, my original, pulled clean from the coffee tin drive. Same image, same open door, same little bag. But beside the original, she'd placed the forensic panel, the hidden data laid out in cold, gray text for the whole courtroom to read. Counsel offered the image on the left, Ruth said mildly, as proof my client abandoned the marital home. The file on the right is the unaltered original. Its embedded data shows it was captured at 10:11 p.m. on a device registered to my client, Elena Reyes, inside that home, after she arrived to collect a child who had been left there alone. The metadata is fully intact in the original. It appears to have been only partially removed from counsel's version. Judge Cole leaned forward slowly. She looked at the screen, and then she looked at Marcus Vane. Is that accurate, Mr. Vane? His mouth opened. I watched him reach for something and find nothing there. For a full year, this man had never once been at a loss for a word. Every letter, every filing, every sneer had come easily to him, because invention is easy when no one is checking. But the metadata was checking now, and the carrier was checking, and a 19-year judge was checking, and Marcus Vane discovered in that moment that he had built his entire practice on the assumption that no one ever would. Your Honor, the exhibit was provided to me by my client, and I had no reason to. You had every reason, Mr. Vane. Verifying an exhibit before you swear it into my record is not a courtesy. It is the floor. She turned back to the screen. I asked if it was accurate. He had no answer, so Ruth continued. She turned to the text message, and she laid the certified carrier records on the bench beside it, the sealed, stamped records subpoenaed straight from the phone company. At 9:52 p.m., Ruth said, still perfectly calm, "The exact minute counsel claims my client sent a message abandoning her child. The carrier's certified records show my client's phone sent no text message at all." At 9:53 p.m., it placed an outgoing call to Mr. Daniel Reyes, which went to his voicemail unanswered. It was the second of 4 such calls that night. So I would respectfully ask the court and counsel, where did this screenshot come from? Because it did not come from any message that exists on either party's carrier network. It does not exist. It never did. Vane tried, then, the only thing a drowning man can try. He said the records must be incomplete. He said perhaps the message had been deleted. He reached, and Ruth, still without heat, closed the last door on him. "Deleted messages," she said, "are still logged by the carrier as having been sent. The record shows no message sent at that time, deleted or otherwise. A message that was never transmitted cannot be deleted, counsel. It can only be invented." She said the word asterisk, invented asterisk, the way you set down something heavy you no longer wish to carry. And she stepped back from the bench. Last, and only then, Ruth called Julian Ibarra. She had held him in reserve the entire hearing, and she used him not as an accusation but as a question. "Your Honor, I'd like to briefly call a witness relevant to Mr. Koss's credibility as an expert, if the court will permit it." Judge Cole, already leaning forward, allowed it, and Julian took the stand and told, in 11 quiet minutes, the story of a photograph 6 years old that had cost him his children's weekday bedtimes and his business, certified by the same man who had just certified mine. Perry Koss, sitting in the gallery, put his face in his hands. Marcus Vane did not look at him. The courtroom went so silent I could hear the clock on the far wall. I could hear Daniel breathing behind his lawyer, quick and shallow. I kept my hands folded, exactly as I had promised myself I would, and I looked not at Vane and not at Daniel, but at the small gray metadata still glowing on the screen. 10:11 p.m. A device registered to Elena Reyes, the quiet proof I had taken with my own cold hands in a doorway 5 months before, never dreaming it would one day stand up in a courtroom and speak for me when I had chosen, all along, to stay silent. And Judge Cole's face, patient for 19 years, changed into something I had never seen a judge's face do. Judge Cole set down her pen. When she finally spoke, her voice was level and low, and somehow that was so much worse than shouting that Vane physically flinched. "Mr. Vane, I have sat on this bench for 19 years. I have seen aggressive lawyering. I have seen sharp practice and gamesmanship and men who would say anything to win. What I am looking at this afternoon is none of those things. What I am looking at is a fabricated document offered under oath to this court as evidence and a photograph deliberately altered to reverse its plain meaning in a proceeding to decide the custody of a 6-year-old child. And I am now looking at testimony suggesting this is not the first time evidence certified by your expert has been used to take a parent's children from them on a foundation that may never have existed at all." She let that hang in the air. Vane started to speak, and she raised a single index finger, not even looking at him, and he stopped as though he'd walked into glass. "You entered an exhibit that the certified records of the carrier prove does not exist. You entered a photograph whose own data contradicts the entire purpose for which you offered it. That is not advocacy, Mr. Vane. That is fraud upon this court, and I will not have it in my courtroom." She drew a breath. "I am striking both exhibits. I am striking the petitioner's motion for primary custody in its entirety. I am referring you personally to the State Bar for a formal disciplinary investigation, and I am directing the clerk to transmit a certified copy of today's record with that referral, along with the testimony regarding Mr. Koss, to the appropriate authorities for further review of any prior matters in which his certifications were relied upon. You will also be subject to a monetary sanctions order, and Ms. Acaffer may submit her fees for my review." Then she turned, for the first time, to Daniel, and her voice softened by exactly 1 degree, which made it land harder. "Mr. Reyes, I don't know how much of this you directed and how much was done in your name. That will sort itself out. But I would strongly advise you to find counsel who does not intend to end his career on your file." I did not smile. I had promised myself in the mirror that morning that whatever happened, I would not smile in that room, because my daughter's father was sitting 10 feet away, and this was, whatever else it was, the worst day of his life. But somewhere deep in my chest, a fist that had been clenched for 11 months slowly, quietly, finally opened its fingers and let go. Here is the part I am proudest of, and it is the part that no one in that courtroom ever saw, because it happened in all the months I stayed silent. Through the entire custody war, I never once mentioned the money. I had known since that weekend on my living room floor in the spring that Daniel had moved $61,000 of our marital savings into an account under his mother Coralie's name, moved it in February, the same season he first cried poverty to the court and asked for support. I had the statements. I had the transfer records, the dates, the account numbers, all of it, photographed twice and waiting behind the Finances tab. I could have thrown that grenade into the middle of the case at any moment and blown Daniel's credibility to pieces in the very first month. I didn't, and I want to tell you exactly why, because it is the whole lesson of my father's life pressed into one decision. If I had revealed the hidden money in month 3, Daniel and Vane would have grown cautious. A cautious Marcus Vane checks his exhibits. A cautious Vane does not fabricate a text message, because a man watching his own back does not commit fraud in front of a judge who's already caught him hiding money. My silence about that $61,000 is the exact thing that let him climb high enough to fall. I did not spend my best evidence to win an early skirmish. I banked it, and I let their confidence do the demolition for me. The custody case ended that April afternoon, but the money did not settle itself. And I want you to see that reckoning too, because it happened in a courtroom of its own, 3 weeks later, and it was quieter than the first but no less complete. Ruth entered the concealment records with the same calm she did everything, in a financial hearing before a different judge, a soft-spoken man named Alvarez who read documents twice before he spoke. Daniel was there. Coralie was there too, small and rigid in the second row, called as a witness, because the account bore her name even though every deposit into it had come, without exception, from Daniel. Ruth walked Coralie through the transfer records one by one, the February deposit of $61,000, the March declaration to the court that Daniel had limited liquid assets and could barely make ends meet, the April request for temporary spousal support based on that same declaration. Coralie's answers grew shorter as the questions went on. At one point she looked at her son, and Daniel looked at the table, and I understood, watching that exchange, that whatever Daniel had told his mother when he asked her to hold the money, it had not been the whole truth either. I felt, watching her face fold in on itself in the witness chair, something I had not expected to feel that day, which was sorrow for a woman who had believed she was helping her son and had instead become a name on a document that would follow her. Daniel's new attorney, Vane, of course, was gone by then, suspended before the ink on the referral had dried, tried a last, thin argument that the transfer to Coralie had been a loan against future support payments, informal but legitimate, a family arrangement misunderstood. Judge Alvarez asked, mildly, for the promissory note. There wasn't one. He asked for any written record at all of the loan terms, interest, repayment schedule, anything. There wasn't one of those either. Mr. Reyes, the judge said, in the same unhurried voice he'd used all afternoon, a loan with no note, no terms, and no expectation of repayment is not a loan. It is concealment with a kinder word attached to it. I watched Daniel's new lawyer close his folder very quietly, the particular motion of a man realizing the file he'd inherited was already lost before he'd opened it. Judge Alvarez found that Daniel had concealed marital assets and had not been candid with the court, and he adjusted the division of everything sharply in my favor. The house, the accounts, the split down the line, plus an amount to offset the 11 months I had spent defending a fabricated custody claim. I never had to raise my voice, not once, in either courtroom. I only had to be patient, and to let two men in a terrible hurry keep hurrying right off the edge, and to let one mother's misplaced loyalty finish what their hurry had started. I did not enjoy watching Coralie on that stand. There was a version of me, 11 months earlier, who might have wanted her humiliated as thoroughly as her son. By April, I found I didn't have room left for that particular appetite. She had trusted her child with $61,000 and her own name, and he had spent that trust the way he'd spent everything else in our marriage, as a resource to be used, not a relationship to be honored. She was not the architect of what happened to me. She was simply the last person standing close enough to Daniel to get pulled down with him, and watching that happen to her taught me something about the shape of the damage a man like that leaves behind, wider than any single lawsuit can measure. Marcus Vane was suspended from the practice of law for 3 years, with conditions attached to any reinstatement. The sanctions order, my legal fees, every dollar of them, came to just over $40,000, payable by him personally, out of his own pocket, not billable to the client he tried to weaponize. Perry Koss's certification was reviewed in 3 additional cases after Judge Cole's referral, including Julian Ibarra's, which was reopened for the first time in 6 years. I heard some months later, through the small-town telegraph of the courthouse, that Vane had wound down his practice and left the county. I did not celebrate. I found, to my own genuine surprise, that what I felt was closer to pity. A man who treats the truth as an obstacle will eventually trip over it. That isn't revenge. That is just gravity, and gravity doesn't need me to gloat for it. Julian Ibarra called me the week his case was reopened, his voice thick, and said only, "Thank you for driving through the wall so the rest of us could see it was hollow." I keep that sentence the way I keep my father's, filed nowhere, carried everywhere. Daniel and I settled the rest without another hearing. He got alternating weekends and 1 weeknight dinner, supervised at first, then, as he steadied himself, found honest work and stopped treating our daughter as a chip in a game, unsupervised, and then ordinary, and then almost easy. I did not fight to erase him from Nadia's life, though I could have, and though a part of me wanted to. She loves him. A father who lost badly is still her father, and I am not in the business of teaching my daughter that people become disposable the moment they fail. That lesson belongs to the men I beat. They can keep it. The lemon tree in the grove finally fruited that spring, the year I got the house, 4 small, hard, ferociously sour lemons, the first the tree had ever managed. I picked them and made a pitcher of lemonade so sharp that Nadia took 1 sip on the back porch and spat it straight over the railing and then laughed until she couldn't catch her breath, mister. Feathers clutched to her chest, the 2 of us in the late sun by the fence. It is, to this day, the best thing I have ever tasted, and I have thought about why. I think it's because it was sour, and it was ours, and nobody could take a single drop of it back. One more thing from that spring, small, and not part of any legal record. Priya Anand had signed 14 months of my badge logs without ever being told why I needed them so precisely dated. The morning after Judge Cole struck the exhibits, I found a card taped to my locker, unsigned. Asterisk, we always knew where you were, every single night. So does the record now. The 7th floor. Asterisk, Priya found me crying over it and just handed me a 2-week coffee and said, "You held 100 strangers' hands so they wouldn't die alone, Elena. Did you think none of us were going to hold yours back?" The record Vane and Daniel tried to build was never the only record of who I was. My father passed in the autumn after the case closed. Near the end, he was in the very hospice where I had spent all those nights holding strangers' hands, and so I got to hold his, which felt like the universe finally settling an account of its own. I sat by his bed the way I'd sat by so many others, and one quiet evening I told him the whole story from start to finish. The coffee tin, the badge logs, the metadata buried where Vane never thought to look, the 3 threads Ruth had braided, Julian Ibarra standing up in a courtroom for a photograph 6 years gone, the judge's raised finger, the money I'd sat on for 8 silent months. He was very weak by then, but when I finished, he smiled, and he lifted 1 hand off the blanket and made a small motion in the air, fingers tapping, the old steno reflex, the ghost of 31 years spent recording other people's truths 1 silent keystroke at a time. "Boring," he whispered, "and patient. A pause to gather the breath. Told you, Mija." I have his little steno machine now. It sits on my desk beside the empty coffee tin, which no longer holds documents. It holds Mr. Feathers, retired and honored, wings up. Some nights, when a hard day comes and the old fury rises up in me and something wants to shout, to chase, to swing too early, I reach over and press 1 key on that old machine, and I listen to it click. 1 clean sound in a quiet room, and I remember whose daughter I am. People believe the opposite of a lie is a louder truth. It isn't. The opposite of a lie is a documented truth. Quiet, dated, saved, backed up, and never fired 1 second before it's needed. For 11 months, I let them call me unstable and absent and cold. I handed Vane the lumber, didn't warn him, didn't chase him, and waited, through the fear, through the near miss at 1 in the morning. For the moment, their own overreach would do what no attack of mine ever could. Ruth and I still have dinner every few months. She took on a young associate last year, and I heard, secondhand, she's already telling him about a client who taught her something about waiting. Julian Ibarra's custody terms were revised 18 months after his case reopened. He sends me a photograph every spring, his kids in front of his Rebuke business, no caption needed. Perry Koss no longer certifies anything in family court in this state. Priya made charge nurse. Daniel married again, quietly, no war invited to that one either, and Nadia likes her well enough, which was all I ever actually wanted from that chapter. Not victory, just peace that doesn't need a verdict to hold. Nadia is 8 now. She still sleeps with Mr. Feathers some nights less than she used to. She does not know most of what I've told you here, and she may never need to. What she knows is that her mother stayed, that the lemon tree fruits every spring, sour and reliable, and that when the world tells her a loud lie, her mother taught her, without ever quite saying so, to go find the shadow and check which way it falls. They told the court I abandoned my daughter. I had every receipt, and when the men in a hurry finally arrived at the truth, they found me already standing there, hands folded, face still, having waited for them the entire long way down. And that's the whole of it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I know how long a story this was, and it means more than I can say that you gave it your time. If the quiet kind of justice, patient, documented, and earned, is what you come here for, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to Revenge Lab so the next story finds you when it's ready. Take gentle care of yourself, and thank you sincerely for listening all the way to the very last word.